Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into one of history's most disturbing contradictions. A story so twisted it sounds like fiction, but happened for centuries across medieval Europe. We're talking about slave markets inside churches. Yes, you heard that right. The same buildings where people prayed for salvation also witnessed the buying and selling of human beings. Before we begin this dark journey, hit that like button if you want more hidden history content, and subscribe only if you genuinely find value in these deep dives. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. It's always fascinating to see our global audience coming together for these historical explorations. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and prepare yourself for a story that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval Christianity and human nature itself. Number 1. God House, Man's Chains. Picture this. It's a crisp Sunday morning in 12th century Europe. Church bells are ringing across the countryside, calling the faithful to worship. You walk through the heavy wooden doors of your local cathedral, past stone pillars carved with angels and saints. The air smells of incense and candle wax. Sunlight streams through stained glass windows, painting rainbow patterns on the floor. You kneel, you pray. You listen to sermons about love, compassion, and treating your fellow man as you would want to be treated. The priest speaks of Christ's message of liberation, of how all souls are equal in the eyes of God. You feel uplifted, spiritual, connected to something greater than yourself. But here's where this story takes a horrifying turn. After the service ends, you don't just walk home feeling blessed. You walk outside those same church doors, and there, in the very shadow of God's house, you see something that should make your blood freeze. Human beings, chained together, standing on wooden platforms, being examined like livestock, having their teeth checked, their muscles prodded, their worth calculated in cold silver coins. This wasn't happening in some distant, godless land. This was happening right here, right outside the place where you just finished praying for salvation and peace. The same stones that heard hymns of worship also heard the cries of people being sold like cattle. Welcome to one of history's most twisted contradictions, slave markets inside and around churches. For centuries across medieval Europe, the very institutions that preached about human dignity and divine love also hosted some of humanity's cruelest transactions. The irony is so brutal, it almost seems impossible to believe. Churches, the supposed sanctuaries of mercy and refuge, became marketplaces for human flesh. The buildings dedicated to a God who, according to Christian teaching, loves all people equally, became venues where some people were literally priced and sold to others. Think about the cognitive dissonance this must have created. People would sing hymns about freedom and salvation on Sunday morning, then haggle over the price of a human being Sunday afternoon. They would pray to a God who supposedly broke the chains of spiritual bondage, while literally forging chains of physical bondage just steps away from the altar. But this wasn't some accident or oversight. This wasn't people occasionally using church grounds for slave trading without permission. In many cases, the church authorities knew about it. Some even participated in it. Some even profited from it. The same institution that claimed moral authority over Europe, that told people how to live righteously, that condemned sins both great and small, somehow found ways to justify one of the most fundamental violations of human dignity imaginable. How did this happen? How did houses of worship become houses of human commerce? How did the guardians of morality become participants in what we now recognize as one of humanity's greatest moral failures? The answer lies in a web of economic necessity, twisted theology, social acceptance, and the kind of moral blindness that happens when power and profit override principles. It's a story that reveals how even the most sacred institutions can become corrupted when they prioritize their earthly interests over their heavenly ideals. But before we judge too quickly, we need to understand that this wasn't just a few rogue priests or corrupt church officials. This was a system that was widely accepted, legally protected, and morally justified by some of the most educated and supposedly holy people of their time. The contradiction wasn't lost on everyone, though. Some people did see the horror of it. Some did question how you could preach love while practicing slavery. But their voices were often drowned out by the sound of coins changing hands and the weight of social pressure to conform. So tonight we're going to walk through those church doors together. We're going to see how the system developed, how it functioned, who participated in it, and how people justified it to themselves. We're going to meet the buyers and sellers, the victims and the profiteers, the resistors and the collaborators. Most importantly, we're going to confront an uncomfortable truth. that some of history's greatest moral failures happened not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, not in secret hideaways, but in the most public and supposedly sacred spaces of their societies. Because understanding how good people can participate in evil systems isn't just about judging the past. It's about recognizing those same patterns in our own world and in our own hearts. Number 2. How it all began. To understand how churches became slave markets, we need to travel back to the collapse of the Roman Empire. Picture Europe in the 5th and 6th centuries, cities crumbling, roads falling apart, central authority vanishing like smoke in the wind. Into this chaos stepped the Christian church, becoming not just a spiritual institution but often the only stable organization left standing. Churches weren't just places of worship anymore. They became community centers, schools, hospitals, banks, and yes, marketplaces. When the Roman legal system collapsed, church law often filled the void. When Roman markets disappeared, church courtyards became the new trading posts. This wasn't necessarily planned or evil. It was practical. People needed somewhere to gather, somewhere to conduct business, somewhere they could trust. Churches, with their stone walls and moral authority, seemed like the logical choice. But here's where things get complicated. While the Roman Empire had certainly practiced slavery on a massive scale, early Christianity had been somewhat ambiguous about the practice. Some early Christian writers condemned it. Others accepted it as part of the natural order. Many simply ignored it entirely. By the time Christianity became the dominant force in medieval Europe, a disturbing compromise had emerged. Slavery wasn't condemned outright, but was regulated. The church developed elaborate rules about who could be enslaved, under what circumstances, and how slaves should be treated. The result was a system where slavery became not just legally acceptable, but morally justified. And where better to conduct morally justified business than at the center of moral authority itself? The first recorded instances of church-associated slave trading appear in the 8th and 9th centuries. Initially, these weren't formal slave markets inside churches. They were more like informal trading that happened to occur near church buildings because that's where people naturally gathered. But economics has a way of turning informal practices into formal institutions. As demand for labor grew, and as certain regions became known for their slave trading, what started as occasional transactions near churches evolved into regular market days. Consider the geography. Medieval European towns were typically built around churches. The church was literally and figuratively the center of community life. Roads led to it. Markets sprang up around it. Legal proceedings happened in its shadow. So when slave trading became a regular economic activity, it naturally gravitated toward these same central locations. The church authorities faced a choice: ban these markets and potentially drive away economic activity that benefited their communities, or find ways to accommodate and regulate them. Unfortunately, too often they chose accommodation over opposition. Some historians argue that churches actually helped make slave trading more humane by providing oversight and regulation. Slaves sold near churches were supposedly less likely to be abused, more likely to receive fair treatment, and more likely to have their basic rights protected. But this argument, while historically accurate in some cases, misses a crucial moral point. Making an evil system slightly less evil doesn't make it good. It just makes it more palatable to the people who benefit from it. The real tragedy is how quickly people adapted to this contradiction. Within just a few generations, seeing slave auctions near churches became so normal that most people stopped questioning it. Children grew up thinking it was natural to see human beings bought and sold on their way to Sunday services. Economic historians tell us that by the 10th century, certain churches had become known throughout Europe as reliable places to buy and sell slaves. Traders would travel hundreds of miles to reach these markets, knowing they could find buyers, sellers, and the legal protections that came with church oversight. This wasn't happening in secret or despite church opposition. This was happening with church knowledge, church participation, and often church blessing. The institution that claimed to speak for God on earth had found ways to make peace with one of the most ungodly practices imaginable. But the most disturbing part isn't that it happened. The most disturbing part is how easily people convinced themselves it was acceptable. How quickly they developed theological arguments to justify it. How thoroughly they integrated it into their understanding of Christian society. By the time we reach the height of medieval slave trading, the association between churches and slave markets wasn't an aberration. It was an institution. Tradition, a normal part of how Christian Europe conducted its business. And that transformation from emergency measure to accepted tradition shows us something dark about human nature. How we can adapt to almost anything if the social pressure is strong enough and the economic incentives are attractive enough. Number 3, blessings and business. Now comes the part that might be hardest to believe, but the historical records are clear. Slave transactions weren't just happening near churches, they were often accompanied by religious ceremonies and blessings. Imagine the twisted logic required to ask God to bless the sale of a human being. Let's walk through what this actually looked like. It's a market day in 11th century southern France. The morning mass has just ended, and people are filing out of the cathedral. But instead of heading home, many are walking toward the church courtyard where wooden platforms have been erected overnight. A merchant from North Africa has arrived with a dozen captured people, mostly young adults taken in raids along the Mediterranean coast. He's not just here to sell them and leave. He's here to sell them properly, according to local Christian custom. The transaction begins with a prayer. Not a private, whispered prayer, but a public declaration asking God to witness and bless what's about to happen. The merchant, the buyers, and even some local clergy gather around as someone reads from Scripture about servants obeying their masters, about God's plan for different stations in life, about the duty of Christians to bring pagans into the fold. Then comes the inspection. Potential buyers examine the people for sale like they're buying horses. They check teeth to gauge age and health. They examine hands to assess work capacity. They look for scars that might indicate a tendency toward rebellion. All of this happening within sight of the church's bell tower. But here's the truly disturbing part. Some buyers would actually pray before making their purchase decision. They would ask God to guide them toward the right slave, as if the creator of the universe was personally invested in their human trafficking venture. One surviving church record from 12th century Spain describes a slave sale where the buyer insisted on baptizing his new purchases immediately after the transaction. His reasoning: he had just saved these souls from heathenism by bringing them into Christian ownership. In his mind, he wasn't buying people, he was rescuing souls. The paperwork for these transactions often included religious language. Bills of sale would begin with phrases like, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit," or "by the grace of God." Legal documents would reference divine authority for human ownership, creating a paper trail that mixed sacred and profane in the most stomach-churning way possible. Some merchants developed elaborate rituals around their slave trading. They would make donations to the church before conducting business, as if buying indulgences for their upcoming transactions. They would light candles for successful sales. They would even commission prayers for the souls of the people they were selling. The psychological mechanics of this are fascinating and horrifying. By wrapping slave trading in religious ritual, people were able to convince themselves they were doing something morally neutral or even morally positive. The blessing of the church transformed a fundamentally evil act into something that felt sanctified. But it wasn't just the merchants and buyers who participated in this religious theater. Church officials would often be present for major slave transactions, lending their moral authority to the proceedings. Some would offer prayers for peaceful and profitable commerce. Others would provide testimonials about the good character of regular slave traders. There are records of bishops actually certifying certain slave merchants as reliable Christian traders, creating what amounted to a church-endorsed quality seal for human trafficking. These certifications would be displayed prominently during market days, reassuring buyers that their purchases had divine approval. The most twisted examples involve slaves who were forced to participate in their own sale ceremonies. Some records describe enslaved people being required to kneel and pray for their new masters before the transaction was completed. Imagine being forced to ask God to bless your own enslavement. Children are often baptized immediately before being sold, with a new owner serving as godparent. This created a perverted version of the normal baptism ceremony, where instead of welcoming a new member into the Christian community, they were welcoming a new piece of property into a Christian household. Some slave markets had permanent altars erected specifically for these blessing ceremonies. These weren't makeshift arrangements or informal rituals. These were established, architectural features designed specifically to sanctify human trafficking. The financial records show that churches sometimes charge fees for these blessing ceremonies. They weren't just providing moral cover for slave trading, they were profiting from it directly. Holy water, ceremonial candles, and priestly benedictions all came with price tags. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of these religious blessings was how they affected the enslaved people themselves. Many of these individuals came from other religious traditions or no religious tradition at all. They were forced to participate in ceremonies that blessed their own oppression, using a religion that was being used to justify their suffering. This wasn't just business mixed with religion. This was religion being weaponized to make evil seem holy, to make oppression seem ordained, and to make participants feel good about doing horrible things. Number 4. The role of the clergy. If you think the church officials were just innocent bystanders who happened to have slave markets near their buildings, think again. The historical evidence paints a much darker picture of clerical involvement, ranging from willful blindness to active participation in profit-taking. Let's start with the bishops. These were the top religious authorities in their regions, the men who were supposed to be moral leaders for thousands of Christians. Yet surviving letters between bishops from the 10th and 11th centuries reveal casual discussions about slave prices, recommendations for reliable traders, and concerns about market competition affecting their diocese revenues. Bishop Fulbert of Chartres, considered one of the great church scholars of his time, wrote matter-of-factly about slave transactions in his correspondence. He discusses the purchase of a particularly skilled Syrian woman for his cathedral's household as casually as he might discuss buying candles or vestments. But individual examples pale next to the systematic involvement revealed in church records. Many cathedrals kept detailed accounts of their slave market revenues. They charged rent for platform space, collected taxes on transactions, and took percentages of major sales. This wasn't passive tolerance. This was active business partnership. Some priests went further, becoming slave traders themselves. Father Benedict of Marseilles appears in multiple 12th century documents as both a celebrant of Mass and a dealer in human beings. He would conduct morning services, then spend his afternoons negotiating prices for captured Muslims and Jews from Spain and North Africa. The monastery records are particularly revealing. These institutions, supposedly dedicated to spiritual contemplation and service to God, often maintain detailed inventories of their human property alongside their livestock and grain stores. The Abbey of St. Denis near Paris listed 3 Slavic boys, ages 10 to 12, suitable for kitchen service, right between entries for sheep and wine barrels. But the clergy's involvement wasn't just about direct participation. It was about creating the theological framework that made slavery seem acceptable to Christian consciences. Prominent church scholars developed elaborate arguments about why owning other human beings was consistent with Christian teaching. Thomas Aquinas, still considered one of the greatest Christian theologians in history, wrote extensively about the natural order that placed some people above others. His arguments provided intellectual cover for generations of slave owners who wanted to feel righteous about their practices. Church law, known as canon law, developed detailed regulations about slavery that never questioned whether the practice should exist at all. Instead, it focused on who could be enslaved under what circumstances, how slaves should be treated, and what rights they retained. The assumption that slavery was acceptable was built into the very structure of church legal thinking. Some clergy took on official roles in slave market operations. Father Marcus of Toledo served as the official verifier of goods for his city's slave market, examining enslaved people to certify their health and capacity for work. His church position gave weight to his assessments, making him a crucial part of the human trafficking infrastructure. The confessional became another site of moral compromise. People would confess their doubts about owning slaves, and priests would absolve them by explaining how their ownership was actually a form of Christian charity. Enslaved pagans were better off under Christian masters, they argued, because it gave them a chance to hear the gospel and save their souls. This theological manipulation was particularly insidious because it transformed victims into beneficiaries in the minds of their oppressors. The enslaved person wasn't being harmed, they were being helped. The slave owner wasn't committing sin, they were performing a Christian duty. Some church officials developed specialties in slave theology. They would be called upon to provide religious justification for particularly questionable transactions, like the enslavement of fellow Christians from different regions or the separation of family members. These theological consultations came with fees, creating another revenue stream for clerical participants. The most disturbing cases involve priests who use their religious authority to facilitate slave trading directly. Father William of Bordeaux would identify vulnerable people in his congregation, widows, orphans, debtors, and help arrange their sale into slavery as solutions to their problems. He presented this as pastoral care while taking commissions from the buyers. Cathedral schools, where future priests were educated, taught courses on household management that included detailed instruction on buying, maintaining, and disciplining slaves. Young men preparing for holy orders learned to see human ownership as a normal part of Christian life before they ever said their first Mass. But perhaps the most damaging thing the clergy did was simply fail to speak out. These were men who claimed to speak for God, who had platforms to address moral issues, who were supposed to be the conscience of their communities. Their silence in the face of obvious evil gave that evil the appearance of divine approval. When people looked to their spiritual leaders for guidance on whether slave owning was right or wrong, too often they received either explicit approval or telling silence. The message was clear. If the church wasn't condemning slavery, it must be acceptable. Number 5. Sunday markets. Here's where the story becomes almost surreal in its contradictions. Sunday, the Christian Sabbath, the day set aside for rest, worship, and spiritual reflection, often became the busiest day for slave markets. The same day Christians were supposed to be contemplating Christ's message of love and liberation became the prime shopping day for human beings. The timing wasn't accidental. Sunday was when most people had free time from their regular work. It was when people traveled to town centers for church services. It was when they had their weekly social gatherings. It was quite simply when the customers were available. Imagine this scene. You're a Christian in 12th century Europe. You wake up on Sunday morning, put on your best clothes, and walk to church with your family. You spend an hour listening to sermons about Jesus washing the feet of his disciples, about loving your neighbor as yourself, about God's special concern for the poor and oppressed. The service ends with a blessing and a prayer for peace. You file out of the church, feeling spiritually refreshed and morally uplifted. And then, literally as you step out the front door, you hear the auctioneer calling out prices for human beings. Strong young man from the eastern lands. Excellent for farm work. Bidding starts at 20 silver pieces. This wasn't happening occasionally. This was happening every single Sunday in dozens of towns across medieval Europe. The contrast was so stark it should have been impossible to ignore, yet somehow most people managed to compartmentalize it completely. Church records from the time show that Sunday slave markets were often the most profitable days of the week. People had their weekly income, they had time to examine their potential purchases carefully, and they could make major household decisions with their entire families present. Some markets developed elaborate Sunday rituals around slave sales. The morning would begin with religious services. Then there would be a brief intermission while the auction platforms were set up. Then the afternoon would be devoted to human commerce. Finally, the day would end with evening prayers, sometimes including prayers of thanksgiving for successful business transactions. The market towns kept detailed records of these Sunday sales, and the numbers are staggering. In a single Sunday in 1156, the market near the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris recorded the sale of 43 enslaved people. That's 43 human lives bought and sold in the shadow of one of Christianity's greatest monuments to divine love. But it gets worse. Some churches started scheduling their most important religious festivals to coincide with major slave markets. Easter and Christmas, the holiest days in the Christian calendar, became peak seasons for human trafficking because they drew the largest crowds and the wealthiest buyers. The Sunday slave markets developed their own twisted traditions. Buyers would dress in their finest clothes, treating the shopping trip like a social event. Families would make day trips out of it, bringing picnic lunches and making social visits while examining enslaved people like they were browsing at a county fair. Some churches offered special market day masses, designed specifically for slave traders and buyers. These services would include prayers for successful commerce and biblical readings that emphasized themes of service and obedience. The priests weren't just tolerating the slave markets, they were providing customized religious services to support them. Children were regular attendees at these Sunday slave markets, not as buyers or sellers, but as observers learning what normal Christian life looked like. Generation after generation grew up thinking it was perfectly natural to combine worship and human trafficking in a single Sunday afternoon. The psychological impact of this regular juxtaposition cannot be overstated. People learn to switch seamlessly between their spiritual selves and their commercial selves, between thinking about eternal souls and calculating the cash value of human bodies, between praying for God's mercy and showing no mercy themselves. Some market towns developed special Sunday pricing for slaves, with discounts offered to people who could prove they had attended morning church services. Having your church attendance verified would get you better deals on human beings, as irregular worship made you a more deserving slave owner. The entertainment aspect of Sunday slave markets became increasingly elaborate over time. There would be food vendors, musicians, and storytellers setting up around the slave auction platforms. What started as a commercial necessity became a social institution, with slave sales becoming just one part of the Sunday social calendar. But perhaps the most disturbing Sunday tradition was the practice of blessing the new purchases. After buying enslaved people on Sunday afternoon, new owners would sometimes bring them to evening services to have their purchases blessed by the priest. The same building where they had just heard about Christian love would then witness prayers asking God to sanctify human ownership. The timing of these markets sent a clear message about Christian priorities. The day that was supposed to be dedicated to God was also the day most dedicated to turning people into property. Actions, as they say, speak louder than words, and the actions of medieval Christians spoke volumes about what they really valued. Number 6. The justification. Now we come to perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story. How people convinced themselves that buying and selling human beings near churches was not only acceptable, but actually morally good. The mental gymnastics required to reach this conclusion reveal the frightening flexibility of human moral reasoning when it serves our interests. The primary justification was what we might call the salvation through slavery argument. This reasoning went something like this. Enslaved pagans, Muslims, or Jews who were sold to Christian masters would be exposed to Christian teaching and have opportunities to convert and save their souls. Therefore, enslaving them is actually an act of mercy that served their eternal interests, even if it harmed their temporal ones. This argument appeared constantly in church writings of the period. Bishop Rembert of Bremen wrote in 1067 that purchasing pagan slaves was a work of charity that serves both God and neighbor. In his twisted logic, the slave benefited by hearing the gospel, the owner benefited by performing a Christian duty, and God benefited by gaining potential converts. But the justifications became even more elaborate. Some theologians argued that slavery was part of God's plan for organizing human society. They pointed to biblical passages about servants and masters, about different people having different roles, about accepting one's station in life. Slavery wasn't opposing God's will. It was fulfilling it. Father Augustine of Hippo's writings were constantly quoted to support slavery, particularly his ideas about the city of God and the city of man. Earthly inequalities were temporary and unimportant compared to spiritual equalities that would be revealed in heaven. A slave who was Christian was spiritually superior to a free person who was pagan, even if the social order didn't reflect this reality. The better a Christian slave than a pagan free person argument became incredibly popular. It allowed people to convince themselves that enslaving someone was actually improving their condition by bringing them into the Christian community, even as property. The physical chains were less important than the spiritual chains being broken. Some justifications focused on the slave's supposed benefit from exposure to civilization. Captured people from less urbanized regions were being elevated by contact with more advanced Christian societies. Their enslavement was portrayed as a form of education, a chance to learn useful skills and proper behavior that they could never have acquired in their original circumstances. The legal justifications were equally twisted. Church law developed the concept of just slavery based on various circumstances. Prisoners of war, people selling themselves to pay debts, children of existing slaves, people convicted of crimes. If slavery could be legally justified, the reasoning went, it must be morally justified as well. Economic arguments were wrapped in religious language. Slavery was necessary for Christian society to function properly, allowing some people to focus on spiritual and intellectual pursuits while others handled manual labor. This division of labor was presented as divinely ordained, with each person serving God in their appropriate role. Some justifications were based on racial and ethnic stereotypes that claimed certain peoples were naturally suited for slavery, while others were naturally suited for leadership. These arguments often included pseudoscientific claims about physical and mental differences that supposedly made slavery beneficial for both masters and slaves. The most insidious justifications involved turning victims into villains. Enslaved people were often portrayed as having brought their condition on themselves through sin, paganism, or rebellion against divine authority. Their slavery was presented as just punishment or necessary correction, with Christian owners serving as instruments of divine justice. Family separation, one of slavery's cruelest aspects, was justified through theological arguments about Christian duty taking precedence over earthly relationships. Separating children from non-Christian parents was presented as rescuing them from spiritual corruption. Breaking up families was reframed as forming new spiritual families within Christian households. Perhaps most disturbing were the justifications that portrayed slave markets near churches as expressions of Christian charity. The argument claimed that conducting slave sales under church oversight ensured better treatment, fair prices, and protection from fraud. The church wasn't facilitating evil. It was regulating necessary commerce to minimize harm. Some theologians developed elaborate theories about different types of human souls. They argued that some people had souls naturally suited for leadership while others had souls naturally suited for service. Slavery wasn't violating human dignity. It was expressing the diversity of God's creation by putting each type of soul in its proper place. The temporary earthly condition justification was particularly popular. Even if slavery was difficult, it was brief compared to eternity. Slaves who accepted their condition with Christian patience would be rewarded in heaven, while masters who treated their slaves well would also earn divine approval. Everyone benefited spiritually from participating in the system properly. But perhaps the most revealing justification was the everyone does it argument. Slavery was universal, practiced by all societies, accepted by all religions, and embedded in all economies. Christians weren't doing anything uniquely wrong. They were just participating in the common practices of human civilization while trying to make those practices more humane and godly. These justifications worked precisely because they allowed people to feel good about doing bad things. They transformed oppression into charity, cruelty into kindness, and exploitation into evangelization. They let people buy and sell human beings while maintaining their self-image as moral, religious, and caring individuals. Number 7. Buyers and sellers. The slave markets near medieval churches attracted a surprisingly diverse crowd of buyers and sellers, revealing how deeply embedded human trafficking was in supposedly Christian society. These weren't shadowy criminals operating on society's margins. They were respected members of their communities conducting business in broad daylight. The buyers represented a cross-section of medieval Christian society. Wealthy farmers were common customers, looking for agricultural workers to expand their operations. These weren't subsistence peasants barely surviving on small plots. They were successful landowners with enough capital to invest in human property and enough acreage to make that investment profitable. Noble families were regular participants in church area slave markets. Lords and ladies would arrive with their retinues, sometimes making major purchases that would be talked about for months. They weren't just buying field hands, they were purchasing personal servants, skilled craftspeople, and sometimes educated individuals who could serve as tutors or administrators. Wealthy merchants formed another major buyer category. These were the people who had profited from trade in goods and were now investing in the human resources needed to expand their operations. They needed workers for their warehouses, assistants for their businesses, and domestic staff for their growing households. But perhaps most disturbing were the ecclesiastical buyers. Monasteries, convents, and individual clerics were active participants in these markets. The Abbey of Cluny in France maintained extensive records of slave purchases, including detailed notes about each individual's skills, health, and potential uses within the monastic community. Bishops purchased slaves for their personal households and for cathedral operations. They needed people to maintain their residences, work their lands, and serve in various capacities within their administrative structures. Some bishops owned dozens of enslaved people, viewing them as necessary tools for fulfilling their religious duties. Even convents participated in slave ownership, though their records show they typically purchased women and children rather than adult men. Nuns justified these purchases as providing protection and Christian education for vulnerable individuals, but the practical reality was that convents relied on slave labor just like other medieval institutions. The sellers came from equally diverse backgrounds. Professional slave traders were obviously common, but they weren't the only source of human merchandise. Nobles would sell their war prisoners, sometimes immediately after battles while the captured people were still wounded and traumatized. Debt slavery created another category of sellers. People who couldn't repay loans would sometimes sell their children or even themselves to creditors. These transactions were often conducted with legal formalities and religious ceremonies, making them appear legitimate and moral to contemporary observers. Pirates and raiders supplied significant numbers of enslaved people to church area markets. Mediterranean pirates would capture people from coastal communities and transport them to European markets. Viking raiders brought captives from their expeditions to Britain and Ireland. These weren't occasional activities, they were regular business operations with established trade routes and customer relationships. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved family members selling other family members. Parents would sell children they couldn't support. Siblings would sell each other to settle inheritance disputes. Spouses would sell each other to escape failed marriages. These intrafamily transactions were particularly common during famines or economic crises. Judicial slavery provided another source of human merchandise. Courts would sentence criminals to slavery instead of execution or imprisonment. These sentences were often handed down by judges who had financial interests in local slave markets, creating obvious conflicts of interest that no one seemed to recognize or care about. The international slave trade brought exotic individuals to European church markets. Traders would import people from Africa, Asia, and the Middle East, advertising them as possessing special skills or representing fascinating foreign cultures. These enslaved people were often displayed like curiosities, with buyers examining them as much for entertainment as for practical purposes. Children formed a significant portion of the merchandise in church area slave markets. They were considered valuable because they could be trained from young ages, were less likely to escape, and required less food and housing than adults. Some markets specialized in children, advertising different ages and capabilities like they were different breeds of livestock. Skilled craftspeople commanded high prices in these markets. Enslaved individuals who could work metal, weave cloth, build structures, or perform other specialized tasks were valuable investments. Some buyers would specifically seek out skilled slaves to enhance their own economic operations or to lease out to other employers. Women were often purchased specifically for reproductive purposes, though this was rarely stated explicitly in the records. Buyers understood that enslaved women would produce children who would also be enslaved, making them long-term investments that could provide returns for generations. The pricing structures revealed how thoroughly these markets had been integrated into the broader medieval economy. There were standard rates for different categories of people, seasonal pricing fluctuations based on agricultural cycles, and sophisticated credit arrangements that allowed buyers to pay for their human purchases over time. Group sales were common, with entire families or work crews being sold together. These bulk transactions often received discounts, with buyers getting better per-person prices for larger purchases. The human relationships being destroyed were treated as minor details in what were essentially wholesale transactions. Some buyers specialized in reselling slaves, purchasing individuals in one market and transporting them to other regions where they could command higher prices. This created networks of human trafficking that spanned the continent, with enslaved people being moved from market to market like any other commodity. The regular participation of supposedly respectable community members in these markets normalized human trafficking in a way that made it seem like ordinary commercial activity rather than moral catastrophe. When bishops and abbots were buying people alongside merchants and farmers, it sent a clear message that slave ownership was not only acceptable, but approved by the highest moral authorities of the time. Number 8. Children of the market. If the general story of church slave markets is disturbing, the specific reality of child trafficking in these venues reaches levels of horror that are almost impossible to comprehend. Children weren't just incidental victims in this system. They were often the most sought-after merchandise, treated with a combination of economic calculation and twisted paternalism that reveals the absolute moral bankruptcy of the entire enterprise. Children as young as 5 years old were regularly bought and sold in the shadows of church walls. Market records from various European cities show consistent demand for young people, with detailed classifications based on age, gender, apparent health, and estimated remaining years of productive labor. These weren't emotional decisions made in desperation. They were cold business calculations made by people who saw children as investments. The justifications for child trafficking were particularly insidious because they were wrapped in language of care and protection. Buyers would claim they were rescuing orphans from starvation, providing homes for abandoned children, or offering education and training to young people who would otherwise have no opportunities. The reality, of course, was that they were purchasing human beings to exploit their labor and control their lives. Some of the most heartbreaking cases involved babies and toddlers being sold immediately after baptism ceremonies. Parents would bring their children to church for the religious ritual, then immediately transfer ownership to buyers who had been waiting in the churchyard. The same water used for baptism would still be drying on the child's forehead as money changed hands and legal documents were signed. Separation of children from their families was handled with bureaucratic efficiency that masked its emotional devastation. Church records contain matter-of-fact descriptions of family breakups, sold mother and infant daughter separately, father retained, children dispersed to 3 buyers, Siblings divided according to age and capacity for work. The pricing structures for children revealed how thoroughly commercialized their lives had become. Younger children commanded lower immediate prices, but were considered better long-term investments because of their longer potential working lives and greater adaptability to their owners' preferences and requirements. Market documents from the 12th and 13th centuries contain detailed analyses of child value propositions that read like livestock breeding manuals. Buyers would calculate the costs of feeding and housing children against their expected years of productivity, factoring in training time, health risks, and escape probabilities. Educational background became a major factor in child pricing. Children who could read or write commanded premium prices, especially if they knew Latin. Ironically, many of these literate children had received their education in church schools before being sold in church markets, the same institutions that taught them or profiting from their sale. Gender determined not just price but also likely fate. Boys were typically purchased for agricultural work, craft apprenticeships, or eventual military service. Girls were bought for domestic work, textile production, or future reproductive capacity. These weren't subtle distinctions, they were explicit categories with different price structures and legal frameworks. The most disturbing aspect of child trafficking in church markets was how quickly children adapted to their circumstances. Within weeks or months, many would stop crying for their parents and begin accepting their new lives as normal. This psychological adaptation was seen as proof that the system was working properly, that children were naturally resilient and benefited from stable ownership. Some buyers specialized in purchasing children specifically for religious training. Monasteries and convents would buy young people to raise as future monks and nuns, though these children had no choice in their religious vocations. Their lives were planned entirely by their owners, from their daily schedules to their eternal destinies. The records show that child mortality rates in slavery were significantly higher than in the general population, but this was treated as an acceptable business risk rather than a humanitarian crisis. Buyers would often purchase multiple children at once, expecting that some would die, but hoping that enough would survive to make the investment profitable. Foster families sometimes served as intermediaries in child trafficking. They would take an orphaned or abandoned children, raise them for a few years to assess their capabilities and temperaments, then sell them to permanent owners who could make informed purchasing decisions. This system was presented as beneficial for everyone involved, though obviously not for the children themselves. The church's baptismal records became tools for documenting and legitimizing child ownership. Baptismal certificates served as proof of age, health at time of purchase, and legal ownership status. Some churches developed special baptismal ceremonies for newly purchased children, incorporating prayers for obedience and gratitude alongside traditional religious blessings. International child trafficking networks developed around certain church markets. Traders would specialize in transporting children from regions of conflict or famine to areas where they could command higher prices. These networks operated with the same efficiency and organization as any other medieval trade system. Perhaps most heartbreaking were the cases of children who were sold by their own parents during times of economic crisis. These transactions were often conducted with elaborate legal formalities designed to make them appear voluntary and beneficial, but the underlying reality was that desperate families were trading their children's freedom for immediate survival. The long-term psychological effects of childhood slavery were rarely considered or documented by contemporary observers. Children who grew up as property developed complicated relationships with authority, identity, and human connection that lasted throughout their lives. Many never learned to see themselves as fully human, rather than as valuable objects owned by others. Some child slaves eventually earned or purchased their freedom as adults, but even then they often remained psychologically marked by their experiences. They had spent their formative years learning that human relationships were fundamentally about ownership and control, rather than love and mutual respect. The normalization of child trafficking in church settings had profound effects on medieval Christian society as a whole. Children who witnessed these markets learned that human worth was negotiable, that power determined morality, and that religious authority could sanctify any practice if it was economically useful. Recovery of childhood for enslaved children was virtually impossible. Even if they were eventually freed, they had missed the developmental experiences that create healthy adult personalities. Their childhoods had been stolen not just by their immediate owners, but by an entire social system that treated their suffering as acceptable collateral damage in maintaining economic stability. The church's role in child trafficking represents perhaps the greatest moral failure in this entire dark chapter of history. The institution that claimed to speak for God who said, "Let the little children come to me," was actively participating in systems that treated children as merchandise to be bought and sold for adult convenience and profit. Number 9. Resistance and silence. In the face of such systematic horror, you might expect widespread resistance, moral outrage, and organized opposition to slave markets operating in the shadow of churches. The reality was far more complicated and deeply disappointing. While some voices did speak out against these practices, they were vastly outnumbered by those who remained silent, and the resistance was often ineffective or easily suppressed. The most common response to church-area slave markets wasn't resistance. It was willful ignorance. People developed remarkable abilities to simply not see what was happening right in front of them. They would walk past slave auctions on their way to Sunday services, attend church events in courtyards where people had been sold just hours earlier, and participate in religious ceremonies that blessed human trafficking without allowing themselves to consciously acknowledge the moral contradictions. This willful blindness wasn't accidental. It required active effort to maintain. People had to deliberately avoid eye contact with enslaved people, consciously redirect their attention during slave auctions, and carefully construct mental barriers that separated their spiritual activities from the commercial activities happening in the same physical spaces. Some individuals did attempt various forms of resistance, though often in limited and ineffective ways. Certain monks and priests would quietly encourage enslaved people to escape, providing them with food, directions, or temporary shelter. However, these efforts were typically small-scale and secretive, more about individual conscience than systemic change. A few bold voices did speak out publicly against slavery in church settings. Saint Adalbert of Prague condemned the practice in several sermons during the 10th century, arguing that no truly Christian community could tolerate human trafficking. His words were recorded and preserved, but they had little practical impact on actual slave market operations. The merchant class, despite their direct participation in these markets, occasionally produced critics who recognized the moral problems. Some traders wrote letters expressing discomfort with selling people near churches, suggesting that such transactions should be moved to purely secular locations. However, these objections were typically based on concerns about appearance and propriety, rather than fundamental opposition to slavery itself. Women, despite having less social power than men, sometimes found ways to resist the system. Some wealthy women would purchase enslaved people specifically to free them immediately, though they had to be careful about how they explained their motivations. Others would provide assistance to escape slaves or help reunite separated families, though always at considerable personal risk. The most dangerous form of resistance came from enslaved people themselves. Despite the enormous risks, some individuals attempted escape, sabotage, or rebellion. However, the church's involvement in slavery made even these desperate acts seem morally questionable to many observers. Resisting Christian masters could be portrayed as resisting God's will, making sympathizers harder to find. Legal resistance was virtually impossible because church law and secular law both recognized slavery as legitimate. The few attempts to challenge slave sales in courts typically failed because the legal system was designed to protect property rights, including rights in human property. Judges who might have been personally uncomfortable with slavery were bound by legal precedents that treated it as normal commerce. Economic resistance took subtle forms. Some craftsmen would refuse to make chains, shackles, or other equipment used in slave markets. Some merchants would decline to provide services to known slave traders. Some innkeepers would refuse accommodation to people traveling with enslaved individuals. However, these individual acts of conscience had minimal impact on the overall system. The most effective resistance often came from unexpected sources. Some nobles who had initially participated in slave markets eventually became critics after witnessing particular atrocities or developing personal relationships with enslaved people. Their social status gave their objections more weight than similar complaints from lower-class individuals. Intellectual resistance emerged slowly among church scholars who began questioning the theological foundations of slavery. A few theologians wrote treatises arguing that human trafficking violated fundamental Christian principles, but these academic discussions rarely translated into practical changes in church policy or market operations. International pressure provided another source of resistance. As trade relationships developed with regions that had different attitudes towards slavery, some European communities faced criticism from foreign partners who found their practices barbaric. However, this external pressure was typically weak and easily ignored when it conflicted with profitable local arrangements. The silence of most church leaders was particularly deafening because of their claimed moral authority. These were men who spoke regularly about sin, virtue, justice, and divine judgment, yet they remained remarkably quiet about human trafficking happening in their own courtyards. Their silence sent a clear message that slavery was acceptable, or at least not worth opposing. Some priests and bishops actively discouraged resistance by arguing that opposing slavery meant opposing the social order that God had established. They taught that questioning the system was a form of pride and rebellion that endangered both individual souls and social stability. This theological manipulation made resistance seem not just futile, but actually sinful. The few organized resistance efforts that did emerge were typically short-lived and ineffective. Small groups of monks or lay people might band together to oppose particular slave sales or help specific individuals, but they lacked the resources and social support needed to challenge the entire system. Perhaps most tragically, the resistance that did exist was often undermined by the resistors' own participation in the broader system. People who objected to slavery might still own slaves themselves, or benefit economically from slave labor, or remain silent about practices they privately opposed. Their moral compromises weakened their credibility and effectiveness as critics. The pattern of resistance and silence around church slave markets reveals how difficult it is to oppose systems that provide benefits to powerful people, even when those systems are obviously evil. The combination of economic incentives, social pressure, legal protection, and religious justification created a framework that was extremely difficult to challenge successfully. The voices that did speak out deserve recognition and respect, even though their efforts were largely unsuccessful. They faced social ostracism, economic retaliation, and sometimes physical danger for opposing practices that their communities considered normal and acceptable. Their courage, though insufficient to stop the system, kept alive the possibility that things could be different. However, the overwhelming silence of the majority reveals something dark about human nature and social dynamics. When evil becomes normalized and institutionalized, most people will choose comfort and conformity over conscience and courage. The slave markets near medieval churches continued operating not because everyone supported them, but because too few people were willing to pay the personal costs of effective opposition. Number 10. The dark legacy of holy walls. As we reach the end of this disturbing journey through history, we must confront what the existence of slave markets in and around churches tells us about human nature, religious institutions, and the terrible things that can happen when moral authority becomes corrupted by worldly interests. The physical legacy is still visible today if you know where to look. Many of Europe's great cathedrals and ancient churches stand on foundations that once supported human trafficking. The stones that witnessed centuries of worship also witnessed centuries of people being bought and sold like livestock. Some courtyards that now welcome tourists once echoed with the cries of separated families and the calls of auctioneers selling human beings. Archaeological excavations around medieval churches sometimes uncover evidence of this dark past. Chains, shackles, platform foundations, and other remnants of the slave trade infrastructure. These artifacts are rarely displayed prominently in church museums or historical exhibits. They're uncomfortable reminders of how badly religious institutions can fail their stated missions. But the physical legacy is less important than the moral and psychological legacy. For centuries, European Christianity demonstrated that it was possible to maintain elaborate theological systems while ignoring fundamental human dignity. The same religion that preached about the infinite worth of every soul also treated some souls as merchandise to be priced and sold. This contradiction had profound effects on how Christianity developed and how it was perceived by others. The gap between Christian ideals and Christian practices became so wide that it undermined the religion's moral credibility. People learned to separate what Christians said from what Christians did, recognizing that religious authority could be used to justify almost any behavior if the economic incentives were strong enough. The theological legacy is particularly disturbing. Church scholars spent centuries developing sophisticated arguments for why slavery was compatible with Christian teaching. These intellectual frameworks didn't disappear when slavery was finally abolished. They evolved into other justifications for inequality, oppression, and exploitation. The basic pattern of using religious language to sanctify unjust systems survived long after the specific practice of slavery ended. The psychological legacy affected both oppressors and victims in ways that lasted for generations. People who grew up seeing slavery normalized in religious settings learned that authority figures could not be trusted to protect the vulnerable, that moral institutions were fundamentally hypocritical, and that power ultimately mattered more than principle. For the enslaved people who survived these systems, the the psychological damage was often permanent. Many never recovered their ability to trust religious institutions or authority figures. Their descendants inherited trauma that manifested in complicated relationships with Christianity, often combining deep faith with profound skepticism about church leadership. The social legacy influenced how European societies understood the relationship between religion and morality. Instead of seeing religious institutions as reliable moral guides, people learned to view them as political and economic actors whose moral pronouncements should be evaluated skeptically. This erosion of religious moral authority had effects that extended far beyond questions of slavery. The institutional legacy shaped how churches approached other moral issues for centuries. Having successfully rationalized slavery, religious institutions became skilled at finding theological justifications for other questionable practices. The intellectual and institutional machinery developed to support human trafficking could be easily repurposed to support other forms of oppression and exploitation. The economic legacy established patterns of church involvement in profitable but morally questionable activities that persisted long after slavery ended. Religious institutions learned that they could maintain their moral authority in public while participating in immoral systems in private, as long as they were careful about appearances and clever about justifications. The political legacy influenced how secular authorities viewed religious institutions. Having seen churches participate actively in human trafficking, political leaders learned that religious moral authority was negotiable and could be purchased or manipulated when necessary. This understanding affected church-state relationships for centuries. But perhaps the most important legacy is what this history teaches us about the fragility of moral progress and the constant need for vigilance against the corruption of moral institutions. The medieval churches that hosted slave markets weren't uniquely evil. They were normal human institutions that gradually normalized evil practices until those practices seemed acceptable and even virtuous. This pattern repeats throughout history and continues today. Institutions that claim moral authority can become complicit in immoral systems when those systems provide benefits to the institution or its supporters. The specific practices change: slavery, genocide, environmental destruction, economic exploitation, but the basic dynamic remains the same. The dark legacy of holy walls reminds us that religious authority, moral leadership, and institutional respectability provide no protection against moral failure. In fact, they can make moral failure more dangerous by giving it the appearance of legitimacy and divine approval. The churches that once hosted slave markets now preach about human dignity, social justice, and moral responsibility. Many have officially apologized for their historical involvement in slavery and committed themselves to fighting modern forms of human trafficking. These efforts at repentance and reform should be appreciated and supported. However, we must also remember that good intentions and sincere repentance, while important, are not sufficient guarantees against future moral failures. The same institutional dynamics that allowed slavery to flourish in church settings could allow other evils to take root if we're not constantly vigilant. The ultimate lesson of slave markets and churches is that moral vigilance must be eternal, that institutional authority must be constantly questioned, and that the gap between ideals and practices must be monitored relentlessly. The stones that once witnessed unspeakable evils now stand as silent warnings about what can happen when good people remain silent, when religious authority becomes corrupted, and when economic interests override moral principles. Today, when you see images of medieval cathedrals or visit historic churches, remember that these beautiful buildings have complex histories that include both inspiration and horror. They remind us that humans are capable of great beauty and terrible evil, sometimes in the same spaces and at the same times. The dark legacy of holy walls calls us to be better than our predecessors, to learn from their failures, and to ensure that the institutions we trust with moral authority remain worthy of that trust. It challenges us to examine our own complicity in unjust systems and to find the courage to resist evil even when it comes wrapped in religious language and blessed by respected authorities. Most importantly, it reminds us that the struggle for human dignity and moral integrity is never finished, never secure, and never guaranteed. Every generation must choose whether to uphold or undermine the principles they claim to value. The medieval Christians who bought and sold people near churches made their choice. Now we must make ours. The walls still stand, but the markets are gone. Whether future generations will say the same about the moral challenges of our time depends on the choices we make today, in our own holy and unholy spaces, with our own claims to moral authority and our own temptations to compromise principle for profit. So here we are, at the end of this dark journey through time. You've walked with me through church doors that opened onto human misery, stood in courtyards where prayers and auctions mingled in the morning air, and witnessed the systematic destruction of human dignity in the name of divine will. But this story isn't really about medieval Europe, is it? It's about us. It's about what humans are capable of when we convince ourselves that our comfort matters more than other people's freedom, that our prosperity justifies other people's suffering, that our religious beliefs can sanctify any practice if we just find the right theological arguments. You want to know the most disturbing thing about this entire story? It's not that it happened 1,000 years ago in a world so different from ours that we can barely imagine it. The most disturbing thing is how easily we can imagine it happening today, in our world, with our institutions, using our justifications. Think about it. Right now, in this moment, there are institutions you respect, leaders you trust, and systems you participate in that are causing tremendous harm to other human beings. The difference is that you've learned not to see it, just like those medieval Christians learned not to see the chains and auction blocks in their church courtyards. We've gotten better at hiding our moral failures, better at creating distance between ourselves and the consequences of our choices, better at developing sophisticated justifications for the unjustifiable. But the fundamental dynamics haven't changed. Power still corrupts. Authority still enables evil. Good people still choose silence when speaking up would cost them something. You think you would have been different? You think you would have been one of the brave voices speaking out against slave markets and churches? Maybe you would have been. But statistically, probably not. Most people weren't. Most people adapted, rationalized, and went along with the system because it was easier than fighting it. And that's not because medieval people were worse than us. It's because humans are humans, regardless of when or where they live. We all have the same capacity for moral courage and the same capacity for moral cowardice. We all have the same ability to see injustice clearly and the same ability to blind ourselves to injustice when seeing it would be inconvenient. The story of slave markets and churches is a mirror, and what we see reflected back at us isn't pretty. We see our own capacity for self-deception, our own willingness to prioritize comfort over conscience, our own talent for finding religious or intellectual justifications for anything that benefits us. But mirrors serve a purpose. They show us what we really look like, not what we imagine we look like. And once we see clearly, we have a choice. We can look away, pretend we didn't see what we saw, and go back to our comfortable assumptions about ourselves and our institutions. Or we can use that uncomfortable knowledge to become better than we are. The medieval Christians who participated in church slave markets weren't monsters. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives, making ordinary compromises with evil systems because those compromises seemed necessary or justified or inevitable. They were people just like us, which means we're people just like them. That's terrifying, but it's also liberating. If they could choose to participate in evil, we can choose not to. If they could rationalize the irrational and justify the unjustifiable, we can choose to see clearly and speak truthfully. If they could prioritize their immediate interests over fundamental human dignity, we can choose to prioritize human dignity over our immediate interests. But only if we're willing to pay the price. Moral courage isn't free. It costs relationships, opportunities, comfort, and sometimes safety. Those medieval voices who did speak out against slavery in church settings paid real prices for their principled stands. They were marginalized, criticized, and often ignored. But they were also right, and history has vindicated them. The question for us isn't whether we'll ever face clear-cut choices between obvious good and obvious evil. Those choices are rare, and when they come, most people make the right decision. The question is whether we'll have the courage to recognize and resist evil when it comes disguised as necessity, wrapped in respectability, and blessed by authority. Because that's how evil usually works. It doesn't announce itself with dramatic music and scary costumes. It arrives wearing nice clothes, speaking in familiar language, and offering practical solutions to real problems. It promises to make things easier, safer, more profitable, more convenient. And all it asks in return is that we stop asking certain questions and stop seeing certain things. The slave markets in medieval churches weren't aberrations in Christian history. They were the logical result of Christians who decided that their economic needs mattered more than their moral principles, that their social stability was worth other people's suffering, and that their religious authority could sanctify any practice that benefited them. We make the same kinds of decisions today. We buy products made by enslaved workers because they're cheaper. We support systems that destroy the environment because changing them would be inconvenient. We vote for leaders who promise to protect our interests even when we know they'll harm other people's interests. We attend religious services that make us feel good about ourselves while ignoring the ways our lifestyles depend on other people's exploitation. The specific practices are different, but the underlying moral dynamics are identical. We've simply gotten better at creating distance between our choices and their consequences, better at finding sophisticated justifications for morally simple situations, better at constructing institutional barriers that protect us from seeing the full implications of our decisions. But the history of slave markets and churches teaches us that these barriers are artificial and temporary. Truth has a way of emerging eventually. The moral accounting always comes due. The children and grandchildren of people who thought they were good Christians buying and selling human beings in church courtyards had to reckon with what their predecessors had done. Our children and grandchildren will have to reckon with what we're doing. They'll look back at our choices, our priorities, our institutions, and our justifications, and they'll judge us just as harshly as we judge those medieval slave traders. Unless we do something about it now, while we still can, while the choices are still ours to make. The slave markets are gone from the church courtyards, but they haven't disappeared from the world. They've just moved to places where we don't have to see them, taken forms we don't have to recognize, and adopted justifications we don't have to question. The children being exploited in factories, the families being separated at borders, the communities being destroyed by pollution, the workers being trapped in debt slavery, they're all still there, still suffering, still waiting for someone to care enough to act. And we're still here, still making choices, still deciding what we value and what we're willing to sacrifice for it. We can choose to be the medieval Christians who walked past slave auctions on their way to church, seeing but not seeing, knowing but not knowing, participating but not acknowledging their participation. Or we can choose to be different. We can choose to see clearly, speak truthfully, and act courageously, even when it costs us something. We can choose to examine our own complicity in unjust systems and work to change them. We can choose to prioritize human dignity over personal comfort, moral principle over practical convenience, and long-term justice over short-term benefit. The choice is ours. It's always been ours. And that's both the terror and the hope of being human in a morally complicated world. The stones of those medieval churches still stand, silent witnesses to both humanity's capacity for evil and its capacity for good. They've seen the worst of what we can do and the best of what we can become. They remind us that we're capable of either path, that we're responsible for the path we choose, and that the path we choose matters not just for ourselves, but for everyone whose lives our choices affect. History isn't just something that happened to other people in other times. History is what we're making right now. With every decision we make, every action we take, every silence we maintain, every voice we raise. We are the historical actors that future generations will judge, just as we judge those who came before us. The question isn't whether we'll be judged. We will be. The question is what that judgment will say about us, about our choices, about our values, and about our courage. The medieval Christians who hosted slave markets and church courtyards thought they were doing what was necessary, practical, and even moral. They were wrong, and history has proven them wrong. We have the benefit of their example, the advantage of hindsight, and the opportunity to choose differently. Whether we take that opportunity or repeat their mistakes is up to us. The story ends here, but the choice continues. Every day, in countless ways, we decide whether we're the people who see injustice and act, or the people who see injustice and walk past it on our way to church. What will you choose? Thank you for taking this difficult journey with me through one of history's darkest contradictions. These aren't easy stories to tell or hear, but they're necessary stories if we want to understand ourselves and our world honestly. The slave markets that once operated in the shadows of Europe's great churches serve as permanent reminders that moral failure can happen anywhere, even in the most sacred spaces, when good people choose silence over courage and comfort over conscience. If this exploration has challenged you, disturbed you, or made you think differently about history, morality, and the institutions we trust with authority, then we've accomplished something important together. Remember to question, to resist, and to never assume that moral progress is permanent or guaranteed. Most importantly, remember that the story doesn't end with medieval Europe. It continues with us, with our choices, and with our willingness to see clearly and act courageously in our own time, with our own moral challenges, and with our own opportunities to choose between justice and convenience. Until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and never stop asking the hard questions that make us better human beings. The future is watching, and history is listening.